Hello, everyone. Welcome to our new episode. I have with us today Dr. Gillhammer. She is a junior research fellow at Christ Church University of Oxford, and her research focuses on biblical scholarship and the Wycliffite Bible and Wycliffite gloss Gospels. So she's also an editor of A Late Medieval History of the Ancient and Biblical World, Volume 2, and she's also an editor of the Wycliffite Old Testament Lectionary. She's published extensively on the subject, and it's very amazing that she's here to talk to us today. So my first question for you, I guess, is, from what I can tell from your research, you're very interested in biblical scholarship, medieval English Bible translation, these kinds of liturgical texts. And I know a lot of graduate students find it difficult to pinpoint their research on something or someone. And I was wondering what you think about that process of choosing what or who to study. How do you approach that process of pinning down what or who resonates with you, and what led you to your own research?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think I did find this really difficult at the start as well, because there are so many topics and texts and authors out there, and it can be really hard to single out one thing and then focus on that. So I think in general, I'd say let yourself be guided by what calls to you. What fascinates you enough that you keep wanting to read about it. Particularly if you're thinking about doing a PhD, perhaps. What fascinates you enough that you could imagine yourself researching it for several years. So I think your own intellectual and emotional response is always a good indicator. What kinds of texts do you love? What draws your attention? And that doesn't necessarily have to be an academic interest at the start. So in my case, I came to medieval studies because I love the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, which is quite a common trajectory amongst medievalists. Lots of us love Tolkien. So as a teenager, I read everything about Tolkien I could get my hands on. And then I started reading the things that inspired Tolkien, so medieval literature. And then I wanted to learn more about that. And one thing kind of led to another. So yeah, follow the things that draw your attention and that call to you. And I think besides that, there's probably an element of serendipity as well, right? So perhaps you'll stumble upon something that you don't quite understand, maybe an idea in a text or a specific word in a text. And you want to learn more about that. And that then leads you to something else. Or perhaps you're reading the scholarship of someone you admire, or a mentor, or a friend, and you find a footnote that leads you to something else that is weird and wonderful and interesting. So overall, keep an open mind and read widely, because you may end up discovering that you're interested in something that you didn't think would be your thing at all, but then it somehow is. So go off the beaten track as well.
That's amazing. Yeah, kind of seeing what can hold your interest, I think is a really probably amazing point, because you are going to be sticking with this topic for potentially many years.
Yeah.
I had no idea that Tolkien was a kind of common like point of interest for many medievalists. That's so interesting.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. He's known as the medievalist gateway drug.
That's so funny. Yeah, so I want to move to the Wycliffite Bible and Wycliffite translations. So in your article, Neither EV nor LV, Independent Biblical Translation in the Wycliffite Old Testament Lectionary, you suggest that the Wycliffite Bible was, quote, the most successful English text before the advent of print. So can you please give us a little bit of background about the Wycliffite Bible? And for listeners, this is the complete translation of the Latin Vulgate into Middle English, and for the first time. And why also is the Wycliffite Bible so significant? Why is it so important?
Yeah, absolutely. So most people aren't familiar with the Wyclifite Bible. So in very basic terms, the term Wycliffe Bible or Wycliffite Bible refers, as you said, to the first complete translation of the Bible into English, which was done in the late 14th century. So I say complete translation because there were earlier translations of just the most important books of the Bible, much earlier on in the Old English period. But now in the 14th century, this is the first time that the full Old Testament and the full New Testament are translated into Middle English. So Middle English is the English spoken in the 14th century. The Wycliffite Bible is translated out of Latin, which may be surprising to modern readers because, as you may know, the original languages of the Bible are Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek. But the language in which the Bible is predominantly known in the Western Middle Ages is Latin. So the so-called Vulgate is the dominant Latin translation of the Bible, which was done by St. Jerome in the 4th century and became incredibly influential on Western Christianity. And so Latin was the language in which church services were celebrated and in which theological scholarship was conducted, writing was done. If you were at Oxford at the time, you would have disputed points in Latin rather than English, the vernacular. So this was the basis of the Wycliffite translation. And I say translation in the singular, but really there are two distinct versions of the translation, interestingly. So it's what we call the early and the later version of the Wycliffite Bible. So kind of, as you may have guessed, the early version is earlier, and it follows the Latin more closely than the later version. So often in the early version, the word order is so close to the Latin that's actually quite difficult to follow in English without also looking at the Latin at the same time. And on the other hand, the later version is much more readable in English. So this suggests that the translators revised the initial attempt at translation and that there was a lot of experimentation going on with language. And then, so why is it called the Wycliffite Bible? Well, the translation is attributed to the followers of the theologian John Wycliffe, who lived from 1328 to 1384. Wycliffe was a priest and an academic who lived and worked at Oxford for most of his life. And crucially, Wycliffe was also a reformer. So he held some very controversial theological views, which were opposed to the mainstream church. And some of these ideas are similar to those of later Protestant reformers. So remember, we're in the 14th century, in the period before the Protestant Reformation. So Wycliffe questioned the value of the veneration of saints, of prayers for the dead, the legitimacy of the papacy. He didn't believe in transubstantiation, things like that. So that's why he's often described as a proto-Protestant. And so he was posthumously declared a heretic at the Council of Constance in 1415, and his writings were banned. Now, there is no evidence that Wycliffe himself was involved in this English translation of the Bible, but it is more likely that the translation was done by his followers who were inspired by his ideas. We don't know who they were. We don't know how many people were involved in this translation project. I mean, we can infer, given the size of the project, that it must have been several people working together. But this is why you often see the term Wycliffite rather than Wycliffe Bible, because we're not sure about the level of his involvement, if at all. And so even though the translation was banned quite soon after it appeared, it was extremely popular. And we have around 250 manuscript copies of it, which survive from the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, 250 may not sound like a lot, but it actually is a lot for the period. So that is more copies than we have of any other Middle English text that survives. So we can infer from that it was incredibly popular. And of course, there would have been many more copies which didn't survive to the present day. So in the period where texts were still copied by hand, before the printing press was introduced into England, it was the most successful and widely read text, if those numbers are any indication.
Wow, that's really interesting. So John Wycliffe is kind of responsible, but also not responsible because he had others writing for him as well. But it's kind of all him. Okay, that makes sense. And also, so in terms of contextualizing this time period a little bit more, can you set the stage for us and tell us some of the key themes at play in the late 14th and 15th centuries when this was all occurring? What do we need to know about what was happening in this period to aptly contextualize and understand the Wycliffite translations and other liturgical texts as well published during this time?
Sure. So I've already mentioned some of the theological controversies surrounding Wycliffe's writings. So there was a lot of back and forth and arguments for and against Wycliffe's position, first within the University of Oxford, but the conflict also spread more widely into ecclesiastical and political circles. So he was an extremely divisive figure. And we have to see this within the context of the church at the time, which was a powerful institution which held significant wealth and political power. Whilst Wycliffe, for instance, argued that the church should give up all its property and that priests should live in complete poverty. But on the other hand, Wycliffe wasn't the only one who held those views. So there were plenty of people within the mainstream church, parts of the clergy and the nobility, who actually would have agreed with him there and did agree with him. Famously, Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales pokes fun at the corrupt clergy who are only concerned with wealth and their own advancement. So this was actually quite a common critique at the time. But there were also very real political implications. In 1381, there was an uprising across large parts of England known as the Peasants' Revolts, in which many members of rural society rose up and marched on London in protest against high taxes imposed by the royal government and local landowners. So we've got the 100 Years' War with France going on in the background, and taxes were extremely high to finance the war. And so these rebels were defeated and many of them were killed, but crucially Wycliffe's ideas on poverty were cited by some of the rebels, and so they contributed to the overall political turmoil at the time. And where Wycliffe really lost the support of even those who had previously been sympathetic to his views on poverty was when he had attacked the doctrine of transubstantiation. So this is the belief that at the sacrament of the Eucharist, the bread and wine are changed into the body and blood of Christ, and so that Christ is really present under the appearance of bread and wine. So that's the doctrine of the church at the time. And Wycliffe was summoned to defend himself when he went against this doctrine, but he dug in his heels, writing new tracts and arguing his case, and eventually was removed from Oxford and lived out the end of his life in his parish at Lutterworth. But with all this political and religious controversy, it can be easy to forget about the parts of the Wycliffite Bible which are in fact entirely aligned with traditional beliefs and the faith of the church at the time. So you mentioned the liturgical texts at the start, which I've worked on in particular. And so what I found really interesting and perhaps a bit unexpected is that the Wycliffite translation was used to translate biblical passages which were read out in church services. So the epistles and gospels which were read at Mass. And so people could follow along in English. And this includes masses for the dead, for instance, even though, as I mentioned, Wycliffe himself was very skeptical of prayers for the dead. So it's a bit of a mixed picture, and we have to be careful not to project later post-Reformation views onto those Wycliffite texts.
Definitely, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for that. So there seems to be quite a period of kind of political turmoil almost happening when these texts are entering the public sphere. And I guess these texts are imbued with such power because of their destructive potential. It's really interesting.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So in your Oxford profile, you write, quote, "I'm particularly interested in philological and linguistic aspects of the Wycliffite translations, including the text translation strategies in rendering the Latin source in the vernacular and their significance within a wider linguistic network." This is very well put, I think. That's why I'm quoting it. And I would love to hear a bit more about this. So what kinds of things have you discovered when looking at a biblical text in translation and how it fits in this wider linguistic network? And also, what kinds of things do you consider, like how do you approach this research process of looking at a text in translation? What kinds of things do you look out for? And where does this kind of discovery lead?
Okay, yeah, so it's basically what I say on the profile is a long-winded way of saying that very practically speaking, I spend a lot of time comparing the English translation, so the early and the late version, to the Latin source text. And I think about what the translators do with specific words, specific phrases, and sentences. So remember that different languages function in different ways. So something that may be expressed in Latin in one way may not work if I translate it word for word into English. The same is true for any language. I mean, if I wanted to translate a phrase like I'm feeling a bit under the weather today into French, I couldn't translate that word for word because it's an idiomatic expression in English that doesn't work in the same way in another language. So I'd have to find a way of paraphrasing that or saying it differently. And so the same is true for Latin. Now, with the biblical translations, we have the added difficulty that what is being translated is a sacred text. And so whether you get the translation right has not only practical consequences in the sense that people may not understand what you mean, but it may actually endanger people's souls if you translate it incorrectly and change the meaning. So this is a concern for the translators. And this explains why the early version, as I've said earlier, follows the Latin phrasing and word order almost in a slavish manner. So to the point that you sort of have to check the Latin alongside the English to make sense of it. And the later version remedies this to some extent, but it's similarly careful to get the meaning right. So, for instance, we often find alternative translations for difficult words and concepts in the English translation. So just one example is the Latin word dormitio, which means sleeping, but it can also mean death, depending on the context. And the Wycliffite Bible, in fact, gives us both versions and translates it as sleeping or death. So it leaves it open and gives us the alternative translation, not wanting to distort the meaning by closing down this ambiguity that exists in one word in the Latin. It gives us two in English. And so these are the kinds of things that I'm interested in. And then I build up a picture from many small observations like this. So overall, we can say that the translators are deeply respectful of the biblical text and that they're doing their utmost to translate it faithfully. And really, the overwhelming sense I get when I work on these texts is the incredibly impressive, painstaking labor behind this translation, really thinking through every single word in detail.
Wow, that's so fascinating that it was such a labor of love and also a labor of labor to actually stick to these words so like closely, so almost dutifully. Almost it almost feels like it was their duty to translate it genuinely word for word, because as you say, they are messing with people's souls. They're messing with their entry into heaven. They're messing with their eternities, I guess you could say.
Yeah, the stakes are very high. Yeah.
Yeah. And how did that affect audiences reading the Middle English text in the 15th century? Were they confused often when you have, because I'm sure the sleep death example, as you say, is only one of many examples. If you have every 10 words saying or, you know, how is that reading experience quite an odd one? Or how do these audiences tend to conceptualize and understand these texts when there are so many ambiguities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we have limited evidence on what people thought of it. I mean, the best indicator that we have is later readers' notes in these manuscripts. So we don't get an awful lot of that, but we do have a couple of copies where we have very engaged readers that kind of make notes in the margins and kind of correct something that they think the translation has got wrong, things like that. So we definitely have some very keen readers who are actively thinking with the translators and think, oh, is it sleeping or death here? You know, I'll make a note. But that's only a couple of manuscripts, and so I guess there's this vast kind of audience that we can only grasp at through kind of little hints on the manuscript page. It'd be fascinating to know more about it, but yeah, that's kind of what we have to work with.
No, definitely. Yeah. And also, if you're mentioning that people are giving their own opinions on how the translation may have fallen shy of accuracy, I'm just curious how many people during this time spoke both Middle English and Latin basically fluently? Was it common or was it actually quite rare?
Well, it was relative. It depends which part of society you look at. I mean, in terms of raw numbers, the vast majority of people were laborers, peasants, who didn't know how to read or write. So really what we're looking at in terms of audiences are the educated classes. And so, you know, that includes people like John Wycliffe, who are academics, who are reading and writing in Latin and English. So that's kind of, you know, the educated elite. But we've also got members of the church, for instance, priests, members of the clergy that aren't kind of at the top end of, the educated elite. So kind of a country priest who maybe knew bits of Latin and, knew how to say mass, but didn't necessarily engage with deep theological scholarship in Latin. So it's kind of it's a nuanced picture. And then we have a reading public, which is linked to urban centres at the time, especially London. So something like an urban elite of merchants, of traders, who are educated, who are wealthy, who have time and leisure to read books. And this is kind of the powerhouse of book production at the time. This is where the demand is. And amongst those audiences, they would have had knowledge of Latin, perhaps not at the top end, because they would have read other types of texts than, say, your scholars at Oxford. But it's hard to determine the exact level of competence. But there's plenty of evidence that even within the church, the people who should know Latin actually know it less well than they should.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. So when this text is being translated from the Latin into the Middle English, is it mainly for the text to be accessible to those who don't speak Latin, like the majority of the society at the time, laborers and things like this?
Yeah. I mean, definitely that's kind of what we might infer, and it is what so the Wycliffite Bible translation comes in many manuscripts with a prologue that kind of explains why it is being translated into English, and that is the claim that is being made. Here are these poor people who don't speak Latin and who are kind of crying out for the word of God in the vernacular. In reality, it's hard to tell in how far that is a posture that is being made in the prologue, because of course many of those who didn't speak Latin, the farmers, the laborers, didn't know how to read or write. So we're looking at somewhere in between that. But that is certainly kind of how the Wycliffite translation sells itself and defends itself as well. Against any kind of accusations of why this is being translated. But there's certainly a great demand for biblical texts, devotional texts, religious texts in English at the time. And so much so that as a reaction to the Wycliffite Bible in the 14th, 15th century, the mainstream church is kind of encouraging translations of biblical material, not necessarily the Bible itself, but biblical stories, reflections on biblical matters in the vernacular, so as to give people that material.
Definitely. And would all translations in this period be considered Wycliffite, or if they were not produced by John Wycliffe and his kind of followers, would they not be considered that, even if they were happening at the exact same time?
No, so Wycliffite really only refers to the translations that are associated with John Wycliffe and his followers. Sometimes in practice, it's kind of hard to tell. I mean, with the Wycliffite Bible, if you have a full Wycliffite Bible, it's kind of clear. But, there are plenty of texts that perhaps were inspired by the Wycliffite Bible, perhaps were using the Wycliffite Bible as a source, but weren't necessarily using it for heterodox or doctrinally suspect heretical means. And in fact, most of the readers or the people who owned Wycliffite Bibles in the 15th century were perfectly mainstream church people, priests, nuns, etc., who just wanted to read the Bible in English and weren't interested in any heretical views about transubstantiation.
Definitely. And do those views come across in the translation? Because you were mentioning that he was quite a controversial figure. Can you tell in the text that his stance is quite different?
So that's an interesting question. I think if you're looking at the translation itself, it's very hard to tell because really it's, as I said, it's trying to translate the Bible really faithfully, being faithful to the Latin into English. But there is a range of other texts that are connected to the Wycliffite Bible. So, for instance, one of them that I'm currently looking at is a set of commentaries on the Gospels. So texts that explain what is going on in the Gospels. And with those, for instance, we have kind of, it proceeds sentence by sentence, Gospel of Mark, first chapter, look at the first sentence, explain what's going on, moving on to the second sentence. And in this commentary, you have little sort of comments, controversial comments interspersed with the commentary that then kind of go on a tangent about how everyone's terribly corrupt in the church, and no one's sticking to the ideal of poverty anymore. And so with those types of texts, it's more obvious that there is this kind of that there are these views behind it. So it really depends which of the many Wycliffite texts you're looking at. So yeah, it's a wide field.
That's really interesting. I can't believe that he would feel comfortable putting such comments in a text that's going to be published publicly. Where does that comfort come from? How is he able to like, does he not fear like punishment, repercussions, jail time, or was that not really a possibility?
It was a possibility. And you know, there are, in the 15th century, there's evidence of some people being convicted of heresy on the basis of owning a Bible in English. But really, it's really difficult to work out in a period before print what actually is in a manuscript, because you'd have to read the whole thing, because no manuscript copy is exactly the same as another. So if I have a library with tomes and tomes of books, and someone were to check what is in these books, they'd have to read them all. Whereas in the period after print, it's fairly easy, right? Because printed books are all the same if it's the same edition. So I think there's a practical element to that, where actually in practice it's who's going to check and how long would it take them to check. You only do that if you're already suspecting someone of being a heretic, or doing sinister things. Otherwise, as I said, a lot of the Wycliffite Bibles were owned by nuns, by priests, and clearly no one suspected them of heresy. So practically, those cases were quite limited, where people had to worry about owning these texts.
That's so interesting to think that print can actually aid in the hiding of controversial texts or controversial comments in texts, because you're right, they are all different. So one might have it and then another one might not have it. Whereas in print, if it's printed, that's it. And you will be accused of printing this because your text is under your name. So that's I haven't ever, thought of that. That's really interesting. I would also love your opinion on what we can learn about how the translators were approaching the Latin and working with such an important text. So John Wycliffe and his followers, but also other people who are translating text around this time. Can we look at their translations and see how exactly they are differing in translation, how exactly their approaches are similar, different? You're mentioning sticking very closely to the Latin as one approach, but are there any ways in which their own style comes out in translation, or we can learn anything about them and how they're thinking about the Bible, things like this, like on a more, I guess, content level or more stylistic level almost?
Yeah, I think on a stylistic level, the alternative translations that I mentioned are quite a good tell. So because they're so common, they're so frequent, they're so painstaking throughout the Wycliffite translation. I mean, it's interesting to compare Wycliffite translations with other translations of the Bible that were sort of around at the same time. And there's one in particular that I've looked at, which is in a manuscript called Oxford Trinity College manuscript 29. Won't tell you very much, but it's essentially a universal history of the world. It's kind of a crazy concept that we don't really have in the modern age anymore. But so it's a huge sweeping framework of a universal history of the world, starting with Adam and Eve at the beginning and then ending in the present. So it's kind of impossible if you were to do that today, because where do you even start, what do you leave out, and so on. But medieval authors were very keen to collect all knowledge and all information known to them in the form of a compendium. And so, of course, biblical history was part of how people looked at the world and how they looked at their own history at the time. And so this universal history of the world contains translations of biblical material from the Bible. But it's quite a different approach here from the Wycliffite Bible, which, as we said, translates the Vulgate without extraneous sources. And so in this universal history, we find biblical stories and episodes embedded into this larger framework at various points. So collecting different sources about the ancient and classical world, biblical texts, but also legends about kings and saints and so on. So it's a hugely impressive project. It's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it. And so one thing that's really interesting is that in this manuscript, we have some religious stories which aren't in the Bible, but which are part of the popular imagination in the Middle Ages, such as the Holy Cross legend. So this is a legend which basically invents a history of where the wood of the cross came from on which Christ was crucified. So it's a bit wild, so bear with me. So it takes us back to the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. And then, of course, Adam and Eve eat from the forbidden tree and are banished from paradise. So this bit is in the Bible. But then in the legend, there's an extra element. So there is a seed from the forbidden tree which Adam's son plants in his father's grave when he dies. And so out of Adam's grave grows a seedling of the forbidden tree of paradise. And then lots of things happen to it. And a very long time later, the tree is cut down and is used to make the cross on which Christ is crucified. So the idea here is a kind of balance, a kind of justice. So the wood from which death comes at the beginning of human history is also the instrument through which humans are then redeemed through Christ. And so we have moments like that in this manuscript, which are really creative in how they play with biblical stories and bring new stories in, which sort of fill the gaps in the Bible itself, whilst the Wycliffite Bible sticks very closely to the source text itself and tries to stay faithful to it, painstakingly so. So I'd say it's quite a different approach in this manuscript, which is more playful, which also makes it really fun to read.
Definitely. And where did they get the ideas for these stories? Did they genuinely just make them up, the writers?
Well, usually there are stories that are told over and over and over. They kind of appear throughout medieval Europe in different shapes, but then they're changed. And you can kind of imagine, with these kinds of stories that are transmitted orally and in writing, someone is copying a text and is adding a bit of extra stuff, or you're telling the story to someone else and you're changing a bit because you can't quite remember it. So it's kind of, there's an oral tradition to them as well, especially these legends, but they're very widely known, and clearly are, by this particular writer in this manuscript, are seen as important enough to be incorporated alongside biblical material. So it's part of the common store of knowledge at the time, if you will. Yeah.
Definitely. So it's almost like myth is being bridged with the Bible and kind of sacred texts, where you have these
Yeah,
both.
that's a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I would love to turn to your article on Oxford Trinity College 29, which is an amazing name for a manuscript. So your article is entitled Non-Wycliffite Bible Translation in Oxford Trinity College 29 and Universal History Writing in Late Medieval England. And in this, you identify a, quote, dichotomy between Wycliffite and non-Wycliffite texts and readers. And this dichotomy is respectively linked to what you call the labels of heterodoxy, i.e. Wycliffite and reformist theological thought, versus orthodoxy, i.e. non-Wycliffite and conservative theological thought. So we spoke a little bit about the distinction of and the significance of this distinction, the ways in which they're different stylistically. They're more playful in the non-Wycliffite, incorporating non-sacred text, myths, stories passed down, other ideas that aren't in the original Bible, whereas the Wycliffite is very faithful to the original Latin. But I'm also curious about the difference in, I guess, thought here, where we have reformist and non-reformist schools of thought going on. So why was this distinction so important? Why was it so politicized? What consequences did it have, if any? You do mention Archbishop Arundel and a lot of censorship taking place after Wycliffite translations were published, and the ways in which that he prohibited any further translations of scripture into vernacular. quote, as you say, made during or after the time of John Wycliffe. So why was this censorship happening? Why were these schools of thought so at odds? Can you just tell us a bit more about what exactly is happening here on a political level?
Right, yeah. So the point I'm making in this article is that a lot of the scholarship on Wycliffite texts operates with these two labels, Wycliffite versus non-Wycliffite, or heterodox and orthodox. And those are helpful categories, but really things aren't quite as black and white. So as I've already said, a lot of the Wycliffite translation is really orthodox in the sense that it is traditional, conservative in terms of doctrine and belief, rather than radical and reformist. So culturally, this distinction is important because after the Reformation, Wycliffe is invoked as this shining forerunner who had the same ideas, and the Protestant reformers are obviously looking to legitimize the profound religious and political changes by referring to this precursor, but also by emphasizing the malpractices and what they think of as aberrations of the mainstream medieval church before, to which the Reformation is then seen as a corrective. So the dichotomy becomes more entrenched and more emphasized under different political and religious circumstances. But going back again to the period before the Reformation, the other thing that's interesting in view of this dichotomy is that there is this censorship against the Wycliffite Bible, as you said, at the beginning of the 15th century by Archbishop Arundel. So this is the so-called Constitutions of Oxford of 1409. So this legislation essentially prohibited any new translation of the Bible since the time of Wycliffe, unless the translation had been approved by the ecclesiastical authorities, so your local bishop. So it's not a complete ban of translations into English, but it's seeking to censor heretical material in the Wycliffite Bible very specifically. So the reason is clearly that Archbishop Arundel and others were worried about heretical beliefs being spread through the Wycliffite Bible and being made available in English to those who didn't have the theological training or wherewithal to spot these errors and heresies. But at the same time, the mainstream church did recognize, as I think I mentioned earlier, that there was a demand, a need for translations of the Bible into English for those who knew how to read, but whose Latin wasn't good enough. So again, we're looking at members of the nobility, the wealthy urban classes, members of the clergy, crucially also women, nuns in religious houses, educated laywomen, and so on. So there was a concerted effort in the 15th century by many writers to render biblical stories and biblical material in English. So the manuscript I've mentioned, 29, is one example, but we also have a wealth of other texts which are often connected with religious orders, such as the Carthusians, who are a powerhouse of writing religious texts at this time. So this also explains why the Wycliffite Bible survives in so many copies, even though there was this censorship around it. And we've spoken a bit about the kind of the practical problems of identifying whether a specific manuscript is actually Wycliffite or not. It's actually not that easy to tell. But clearly there was a great demand in the 15th century. People wanted to read the Bible in English.
Yeah, interesting. I just have one question about the heretical beliefs being spread. That was a very kind of in-depth answer. Thank you so much. I think that like you very much flushed out those political tensions. You mentioned if the Wycliffite would be if it were to be translated continuously, the Archbishop and kind of the other people who were monitoring the public consumption of the Bible were worried about people understanding heretical beliefs from the Wycliffite. So my question is, if it was translated so faithfully from the Latin, kind of word for word, how could any heretical beliefs get through if the translation is so faithful? That was my question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think partly it's the fact that there exist these other Wycliffite texts, like the gospel commentaries that I mentioned, that really go into depth on these polemical issues. Also, the prologues of the Wycliffite Bible contain these types of criticisms. But I think there's perhaps also another concern that's a broader one, which is if you give the Bible in English to people who don't have the theological training to actually interpret it correctly, because the Bible is a really complex text and there's an established tradition of exegesis, of making sense, interpreting the Bible in an established way, which agrees with the doctrine of the church. If you don't have that background and you're given unmediated access to the biblical text, that may lead to misinterpretation. And so I think that's the other concern that ecclesiastical authorities have. What are people going to do with it if they haven't been trained in how to read it correctly? So that's another concern.
So there really is this intense monitoring of how people are consuming and approaching the Bible, it seems. They're really trying to monitor their minds almost.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a lot of thought about it. In how far that was happening practically is a different question. But there's certainly, I mean, the constitutions of Oxford, Archbishop Arundel's constitutions at the beginning of the 15th century, is very much the end point of a debate that is basically amongst scholars at Oxford. Which basically in which they're arguing about whether the Bible should be translated into English. And this isn't Wycliffite, so these are this is within the mainstream church scholars at Oxford. And some of them are saying, well, I mean, it's really dangerous if we give this translation to people who haven't been trained in how to read it. They may get the wrong idea. But then there are others who are saying, well, actually, the Vulgate itself, the Latin, was originally a translation into the common people's language. So Latin was spoken at the time, and it was translated out of Greek for that very reason, because people wanted to understand it. So actually, there's absolutely no grounds for not translating it into this language now. And so it's an ongoing debate, and really the constitutions of Oxford show that the more stringent line, the more prohibitive line wins out for a bit. But then in practice, we have evidence of all of these copies being disseminated really widely. So the debate is one thing and the legislation is one thing, but the practice of what people are reading, it seems to be another thing.
Definitely. I guess that's because the public will always win out over the voices of the few, because you have that public push to understand the Bible potentially, or eventually it will maybe spread as it did spread globally. Now that the Bible today is everywhere. I'm wondering what you think about the extent of translation this one text has gone through. I think it probably is, I'm sure it is, the most translated text in the world, because it's been around, probably the longest text in the world, or if not one of them. And so I guess certain people speak about translation now with regard to contemporary texts, like, for example, texts that have been translated like throughout the Western world, or classic texts that have been translated throughout the entire world. But the Bible has undergone so many translations with ancient languages as well as contemporary languages. And I'm wondering, it's kind of an abstract question, but I'm wondering what you think about the meaning. Is there any meaning lost with regard to how many translations the Bible has gone through? Can we just keep translating the Bible forever and ever, from the Greek and the Hebrew to Arabic to Middle English, like Old Slavonic, real, like a contemporary English, the English that we know of today? Can it just be translated into any language without being changed? I guess this is the concern that we're talking about right now. What do you think about this concern? Do you think meaning is lost? Like, do you think it is changed, or it's actually completely fine?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think certainly in an ideal scenario, you would be translating not what the Wycliffites are doing from Latin that has come from Greek, and the Greek has been translated from Hebrew in some cases, but directly going back to the original text. So obviously there's a Chinese whispers effect that, if you translate from another language, then more and more gets lost in translation. But there's certainly, I mean, arguably there is no complete synonym for a word in any language ever, right? So there's always something that must be lost. There's an excellent book by a colleague of mine, John Barton, called The Word. So he's he's much more of an expert in biblical languages than I am. And so he talks exactly about that, about the history of translating the Bible. And he has some really interesting examples of words that sort of have become common parlance in English because the King James Bible has been so culturally important and influential. But actually, if you go back to the Greek or the Hebrew, it actually says something different to what we think it means. So there are plenty, and there's sort of famous examples of mistranslations as well, like the Britches Bible famously, and so on. So some of them are quite funny.
That's so interesting. I guess the really fascinating part about all of this is that translation within contemporary languages, often some meaning is lost because, for example, there are certain words in French culture that, as an American, I can't fully pinpoint the sense or connotation or evocation or vibe of that word because I am not associated with that culture in that way. So I can't see exactly the feeling associated with that word. So even with contemporary language, there is an issue with translation. But here we are dealing with words that have been used thousands of years ago that may have gone extinct, right? Maybe we actually don't have a word for this word anymore because we're translating with languages, ancient languages and contemporary language. I'm saying even in contemporary, there's meaning loss because of the culture. We know exponentially less about these ancient cultures. So how can we understand the ways in which they're using these words? It almost seems impossible.
It's a very fair concern. And I think that's, I mean, obviously that is the case. And the medieval translators are also aware that that is the case. And so that's partly where this concern with having an interpretive framework comes from. Because there is this tradition of interpretation of exegesis, which thinks exactly about that, you know, and so that's kind of passed down through generations from scholar to scholar, and then there are some Hebrew scholars that add to it, and so on. So it's partly about the question of within its contemporary culture, what does that mean, and how can we then understand it within our culture? So when for example, when Jesus talks about the eye of the needle, what does that mean? You know, so lots of cultural references like that. And so what we find in medieval commentaries, they're sometimes incorrect, but sometimes they're not, is exactly this attempt to explaining these cultural references and then applying them in a sense that can be understood by an audience in a different culture. Yeah, 100%.
Definitely. It almost seems like you actually do not want to translate word for word. You want to understand what it means in their culture, understand the connotation, the meaning of that, then translate into your culture in terms of connotation, and then make sure it makes sense in the vernacular, make sure we can understand it easily. But I guess when you translate word for word with no sense of what was this actually getting at, the kind of meaning behind these words in their culture that we can then translate to meaning in our culture, if you're just going on the surface level of word, it almost seems counterproductive in a way.
Absolutely. And those are, I mean, this is kind of often described as, if you kind of imagine it as a spectrum, you have on one end the kind of word for word translation, which obviously doesn't work. And on the other end of the spectrum is the sense by sense translation. So you think about what it means and you then translate that meaning, and that can take different forms. Again, I really recommend John Barton's book on this. But again, the medieval translators are aware of those problems. So there are theoretical discussions of how do you translate? What do you do with different languages that don't map onto each other? And then you've also got a completely different cultural framework. So those are the things that the Wycliffite translators and other translators contend with in every single word and every single sentence. So which again just shows how impressive an achievement it is, even if they get it wrong sometimes.
Definitely. Yeah. I think translating from ancient text to medieval text to contemporary text, there's such a trajectory, there's such a long history, and there is such a long kind of path of translation of word, capital W, because this is the word, the original word. And getting it wrong can have, as you say, repercussions upon people's souls in the medieval times as well. So that's, it certainly is a massive feat. And yeah, I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. I so appreciate it. I've learned a lot. I'm sure all of our listeners have too.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And I think my kind of closing question for you today is, do you have any advice for young scholars who are interested in this topic, who may be just beginning to research liturgical text, Wycliffite translations, the Bible in translation, maybe even translation with regard to medieval literature and Middle English, Old English? What advice do you have for people who have this interest, who are looking to expand upon it?
Yeah, I mean, of course, with the humanities, the advice is usually read lots of books. But I think especially if you're interested in liturgical texts, the practical use of these texts, or their Latin counterparts in church services, in worship, ritual practices, and so on, I'd say, obviously, yes, we have all these texts that are super interesting and worth researching, but don't forget that liturgy is also a living practice, and that there are many things that the texts don't capture. So there's so much more to a church service. You can imagine there's light and darkness, and the smell of incense, and a cold draft in the church, and candlelight, and music, and symbolic objects, and these high vaulted arches if you're in a cathedral. So all of the senses are involved, really, but you can't see any of that in the text, or you only get occasional glimpses. So I'd say try and think about these texts, if it's specifically liturgy that you're looking at. Think about these texts as much as possible within these contexts. Go and see different church services. Of course, so I'm working specifically on the Western Christian tradition, but this is also rooted in Jewish practices, and has connections with Eastern Orthodox liturgy and so on. So try and get a sense of many different ritual, cultural practices. Listen to the music which would accompany these liturgies, because it really is a multidimensional experience, which makes it so incredibly powerful. So there's lots to be discovered.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Yeah, that is a brilliant answer. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I want to say thank you for joining us today. And anyone who's interested in this should definitely follow Dr. Gillhammer's advice, and also read the text that she recommended. And I think that it's amazing that you're bringing more attention to these topics, because I think they are very almost under-researched in the fields of English literature, these translations and Wycliffite translations as well, and the Gospels, the prologues, the commentaries, and the margins. What are these people actually thinking about the ideas about which they're writing? These are all really interesting ideas that we're thinking about here, I think. So I think it's an amazing thing that you're doing, and I want to say thank you so much for coming on this podcast today.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun.